They laughed when the veteran inherited a broken watch. But minutes later, his German Shepherd uncovered a secret buried for 50 years, worth $198 million. In a quiet Wyoming town, Caleb Brooks thought the worst part of his life was already behind him. A former soldier carrying the weight of war, he expected nothing when his uncle's will was read. The family fought over land and money, leaving Caleb with nothing but an old pocket watch that didn't even work. People mocked him. But that same night, his loyal German Shepherd, Atlas, began acting strangely around the watch. And what the dog uncovered would lead them to a hidden secret beneath the mountains, one that had been waiting decades to be found. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from today. Drop your city or country in the comments. The wind that morning carried the dry smell of pine and dust through the quiet streets of Laramie, Wyoming. It was the kind of wind that scraped across the mountains and settled into the bones of old buildings and older men. Caleb Brooks stood outside a narrow brick office on Main Street, staring at the faded gold letters on the glass door. Bennett and Associates, attorney at law. Beside him sat Atlas. The German Shepherd was large even for his breed, his black and tan coat thick against the cold Wyoming air. His ears stood tall, his dark eyes alert. While Caleb stared at the door, Atlas watched the street, every passing car, every creak of a sign swinging in the wind. Atlas had learned that habit years ago, in Afghanistan. Caleb pushed the door open. A small bell above the frame rang softly. Inside, the office smelled like old paper, leather chairs, and coffee that had been sitting too long on a hot plate. 5 people were already seated around a wooden table. Family. Or at least people who shared the same last name. Caleb's cousin, Laura Brooks, was the first to notice him. She leaned back in her chair with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, look who finally showed up," she said. "The soldier." Caleb nodded once. Laura. Her husband, a tall man with slicked back hair, glanced down at Atlas. "You brought the dog?" "He stays with me," Caleb replied calmly. Atlas moved forward and settled quietly beside Caleb's chair, resting his large head near Caleb's boot. Across the table sat an elderly man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. Mr. Bennett. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Now that everyone is here, we can begin." He adjusted the papers in front of him. "This is the final will and testament of Samuel Brooks." Caleb felt something tighten in his chest when he heard the name. Samuel Brooks had been his uncle, or more accurately, his father's older brother. The man had lived alone for decades in the mountains outside Cheyenne. No wife, no children. Barely any contact with the rest of the family, except for Caleb. When Caleb was a kid, Uncle Samuel had been the only adult who treated him like he mattered. But Samuel had died 3 weeks ago. Heart failure. Caleb hadn't even made it to the funeral. He had been driving freight trucks in Montana when the call came. Mr. Bennett continued reading. Samuel Brooks leaves his residential property in Jackson County to Laura Brooks. Laura's smile widened immediately. "Well, that makes sense," she said lightly. Her husband squeezed her hand. The lawyer continued. "The remaining bank accounts will be divided equally between Laura Brooks and Daniel Brooks." Another cousin nodded with satisfaction. Caleb said nothing. He hadn't expected anything. Uncle Samuel hadn't been rich, just a quiet man who lived in a cabin surrounded by trees. Mr. Bennett flipped the page. "Finally, there is one personal item designated for Caleb Brooks." Laura chuckled.
Oh, this should be good. The lawyer opened a small velvet pouch sitting beside the papers. From it, he removed a silver pocket watch. The metal was scratched and dull with age.
The chain was broken, and the glass face had a thin crack running across it. Mr. Bennett placed it gently on the table. This pocket watch was specifically left to Mr. Caleb Brooks. For a moment, no one said anything. Then Laura laughed. Not a polite laugh, a real one. "You're kidding!" Her husband leaned forward. "That thing looks like it came from a pawn shop." Daniel smirked. "Guess Uncle Sam thought you needed help keeping track of time." Caleb looked at the watch. The silver casing was worn smooth in places where someone had held it thousands of times. He reached out and picked it up. It felt heavier than it looked. Atlas lifted his head slightly. The dog's nose twitched. He leaned forward and sniffed the watch once, then again, slowly, carefully. Caleb noticed. Atlas didn't usually react to ordinary objects. Laura crossed her arms. "That's it? No money, Caleb?" Her voice dripped with amusement. "You served what, 10 years in the army?" "8," Caleb replied quietly. "Well," she said, shrugging, "I guess your reward is a broken clock." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "You planning to sell it?" "Maybe you'll get $20. More laughter. Caleb ignored them. He turned the watch over in his hands. Then he pressed the small latch and opened the cover. Inside, the white clock face stared back at him. The hands had stopped. 3:47. 3:47. They hadn't moved in years. Caleb stared at the frozen time. Something about it felt strange. Not wrong. Just deliberate. Atlas suddenly stood up. The chair legs scraped against the wooden floor as the dog stepped closer to Caleb. His ears were forward. His eyes locked on the watch. Then Atlas gave a low, quiet growl. Not aggressive, more like a warning. The room went silent. Laura rolled her eyes. "Oh, please." "It's just an old watch." Mr. Bennett cleared his throat. "There is also a note." Everyone looked up. The lawyer slid a small folded card across the table. "To be opened by Caleb Brooks." Caleb unfolded it. The handwriting was rough but familiar. Uncle Samuel's. "Caleb, some things are worth more than money. When the time comes, you'll understand why it stopped. S.B." Caleb read the words again and again. Laura leaned across the table. "Well?" "What does it say?" Caleb folded the card and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "Nothing important." She frowned. "Seriously?" Caleb stood. Atlas stepped back beside him immediately, ready to leave. Mr. Bennett watched him. "Mr. Brooks, your uncle asked me to say one more thing." Caleb paused. "What?" The lawyer adjusted his glasses. "He said you were the only one patient enough to listen." Caleb looked down at the watch again. 3:47. Atlas nudged Caleb's hand gently with his nose. The dog's eyes never left the watch. Outside, the Wyoming wind rattled the windows. Caleb slipped the pocket watch into his coat. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett." Laura shook her head. "You drove all the way here for that?" Caleb walked toward the door. Atlas padded beside him. Just before leaving, Caleb stopped. He turned back toward the table. "You ever notice something strange about old things?" he said quietly. Laura raised an eyebrow. "What?" Caleb looked at the watch in his hand.
Sometimes they stop working for a reason. Then he stepped outside. The cold mountain air hit his face. Atlas sat beside him on the wooden porch. The dog looked up at Caleb, then back at the watch in Caleb's hand. Atlas sniffed it again. And this time, the dog let out a soft, uneasy whine, as if he could smell something buried deep inside the past. Caleb stared at the frozen hands. 3:47. For the first time since leaving the army, something stirred in his chest. Not fear, not pain. Something else. Curiosity.
He had no idea that the broken watch in his hand would soon lead him into the mountains, to a secret no one had touched for 50 years, and to a discovery worth nearly $200 million. But Atlas already seemed to know. The dog kept staring at the watch, waiting. Caleb Brooks sat in the cab of his old pickup truck outside the lawyer's office, the engine idling softly as the Wyoming wind rattled the loose metal sign above the building. The sky had turned gray, the mountains in the distance hidden behind a slow-moving wall of clouds. Atlas still hadn't taken his eyes off the pocket watch. The German shepherd's nose twitched again. Caleb held the watch in his palm and studied it more carefully. The silver casing was scratched, worn smooth at the edges. Whoever carried it had used it for years, maybe decades. The crack across the glass looked old, like it had happened a long time ago. But the hands, they were frozen perfectly at 3:47. Not bent, not broken, just stopped. Atlas let out another quiet whine. "You smell something, boy?" Caleb murmured. Atlas leaned closer, sniffing again before sitting back on his haunches, ears forward. The dog looked confused. Caleb slipped the watch into his jacket pocket and started the truck. The engine coughed once before settling into its familiar rumble. They drove north out of town. The road cut through long stretches of open land where winter grass bent under the wind. Snow still clung to the shadows along the hillsides, and the pine forests beyond the valley looked dark and endless. Atlas rested his head near the window, watching the passing landscape. Caleb drove in silence. For most people, quiet roads meant peace. For Caleb Brooks, silence could be dangerous. His small cabin sat nearly 40 miles outside Laramie, tucked between two ridges and surrounded by tall pine trees. It wasn't much, just a one-room structure with a wood stove, a narrow porch, and a truck parked beside a stack of firewood. But it was far enough away from people. That was what Caleb preferred. He killed the engine and stepped out. The air smelled like snow and pine sap. Atlas jumped down from the truck and stretched before trotting beside Caleb toward the cabin. Inside, the small space warmed quickly once Caleb lit the stove. Flames cracked softly behind the iron door while the wind pushed against the wooden walls. Atlas circled once near the rug before lying down. Caleb hung his jacket on a nail beside the door. The pocket watch slid from the pocket and landed softly on the table. Atlas immediately lifted his head. Again. The dog stared at it. Caleb noticed. "That watch bothering you?" Atlas didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on the silver object like it was alive. Caleb shook his head and sat down. He made coffee, poured it into a chipped mug, and stared out the frosted window. The mountains looked darker now. Storm coming. Night fell early in Wyoming. By 9 o'clock, the world outside had disappeared into blackness. Inside the cabin, the fire cast long shadows along the walls. Caleb sat in his chair, turning the pocket watch over and over in his hands. 3:47. He couldn't stop thinking about it. Finally, he snapped the cover open again. The tiny ticking mechanism inside had long since stopped moving. Dead. But the time it displayed, that time was burned into Caleb's memory. 3:47. He closed his eyes. And suddenly, the cabin wasn't quiet anymore. The memory came like it always did. Loud, bright, violent. Sand, heat, the roar of helicopters. Afghanistan. Caleb was back in the desert, crouched behind a burned-out vehicle while the air filled with the sharp cracks of gunfire. The sky above them glowed orange with smoke and dust. "Brooks!" The voice echoed in his head. His best friend, Private Ethan Walker. Ethan had been laughing minutes earlier. Now he was lying in the dirt, bleeding. Caleb had grabbed Ethan's vest, trying to pull him to safety. "Stay with me, man!" Caleb had shouted. But Ethan's eyes were already fading. A medic looked at his watch. "Time of death," the medic said quietly. 3:47. Caleb's eyes snapped open. He was breathing hard. His hands were shaking. The coffee mug rattled against the table as he set it down. The cabin felt smaller now, the shadows darker. Atlas was already standing. The German shepherd moved quickly across the room and pressed his body against Caleb's legs. The dog had done this dozens of times before. Atlas lifted his head and pushed his nose gently against Caleb's chest. A grounding signal. Training from years earlier. Caleb placed his hand on the dog's thick fur. "Easy," he whispered. Atlas stayed there until Caleb's breathing slowed, until the shaking stopped. Only then did the dog step back. Caleb wiped his face with his sleeve and looked down at the pocket watch again. 3:47. The same time. The same exact minute Ethan had died. Caleb frowned. That can't be a coincidence. Atlas returned to the table. The dog sniffed the watch again, more intensely this time. Then Atlas let out a low growl. Caleb leaned forward. "What is it?" Atlas pawed gently at the watch, not aggressively, more like he was trying to tell Caleb something. Caleb picked it up. The watch felt heavier now. Strange. He pressed the latch again and opened the back panel. The small mechanical gears sat perfectly still, but something looked different this time. There was a thin line along the inner casing, almost like a seam. Caleb squinted. That wasn't there before. He grabbed a small screwdriver from the toolbox near the door. Carefully, he pressed it against the seam and twisted. Click. A hidden panel popped open inside the casing. Caleb blinked. "Well, I'll be." Atlas's tail began to wag slowly. Inside the watch, tucked neatly beneath the inner mechanism, was something folded tightly. A tiny piece of paper. Caleb used his fingers to pull it free. The paper was old, yellowed with age. He unfolded it carefully. Two things fell onto the table. A small brass key and a slip of paper with numbers written in faded ink. Caleb leaned closer. Coordinates. GPS coordinates. Atlas barked once, sharp, excited. Caleb stared at the numbers again. They pointed somewhere deep in the Wyoming mountains, far from any town, far from any roads. Uncle Samuel, Caleb muttered softly. What were you hiding? Atlas wagged his tail faster now. The dog looked at Caleb, then at the paper, then back at Caleb again, like he already knew what came next. Caleb leaned back in his chair. Outside, the wind howled across the mountains. Snow began tapping against the cabin windows. He looked down at the coordinates again, then at the brass key, then at the pocket watch still frozen at 3:47. Something inside him shifted. The quiet life he had built in this cabin suddenly felt temporary, like it had been waiting for something, waiting for this moment. Atlas gave a soft, impatient bark. Caleb chuckled under his breath. Yeah, I see it too. He folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. The key followed. Then he closed the watch. 3:47, still staring back at him. Caleb looked out the window at the dark mountains rising beyond the trees. Guess we're taking a trip, boy. Atlas's ears shot straight up. The dog stood immediately, tail wagging. For the first time in a long time, Caleb Brooks felt something stronger than the ghosts of war. Purpose. And somewhere deep in the mountains of Wyoming, something had been waiting 50 years to be found. The storm moved across the valley during the night. Snow gathered along the edges of Caleb Brooks's cabin roof, and the wind howled through the pine trees like distant voices calling from the mountains. Caleb barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the numbers again. Coordinates. A location far beyond the highways and towns, buried somewhere in the high country of Wyoming. Atlas didn't sleep much either. The German shepherd stayed near the table most of the night, occasionally lifting his head to sniff toward the pocket watch that now sat beside Caleb's folded map. Just before dawn, Caleb gave up on trying to sleep. He rose from the chair, added another log to the wood stove, and spread an old paper map across the kitchen table. Atlas walked over immediately. The dog's nails clicked softly on the wooden floor as he sat beside Caleb. All right, Caleb muttered. Let's see where this thing leads. He unfolded the small slip of paper again and carefully wrote the coordinates onto the map using a pencil. Then he measured the grid. Once, twice, a third time. His brow slowly tightened. Well, I'll be damned. The point landed deep in the mountains west of Jackson County. No towns, no highways, just forest, cliffs, and miles of wilderness. The nearest dirt road ended almost 20 miles away. Caleb leaned back in his chair. What were you doing out there, Uncle Samuel? Atlas nudged Caleb's arm. Caleb looked down at the dog. Atlas's tail thumped once against the floor. You want to go, don't you? The dog's ears perked immediately. Caleb laughed quietly. Thought so. He folded the map and slid it into his jacket pocket. By sunrise, the storm had passed. The sky opened into a pale winter blue while sunlight spilled across the mountain ridges like gold dust. Caleb loaded his truck slowly, methodically, like he had done hundreds of times before heading into unknown territory. Old habits from the army. Rope, flashlights, first aid kit, extra fuel. Atlas watched the process carefully from the porch. When Caleb grabbed his jacket, the dog jumped into the passenger seat without being told. You're not missing this, huh? Atlas wagged his tail. The engine roared to life. They drove west. The highway cut through wide valleys surrounded by snow-covered peaks. Elk moved slowly across distant fields, and the wind pushed long waves through the dry grass along the roadside. The farther they drove, the fewer cars Caleb saw. Eventually, the paved road turned into gravel, then dirt, then barely more than a narrow trail between trees. By noon, the mountains towered above them. Towering pine forests swallowed the road, their branches heavy with snow. The truck climbed slowly up the winding path while the engines strained against the steep incline. Atlas stayed alert, his nose pressed against the window. Halfway up the mountain, the road finally ended. Caleb parked near a fallen wooden sign, half buried in snow. The words had faded almost completely, but Caleb could still read the outline. Brooks Ridge Property. He stepped out of the truck. Cold mountain air rushed into his lungs. The silence up there felt different, deeper. Atlas jumped down beside him and immediately began sniffing the ground. Caleb looked around. The coordinates on the map pointed somewhere beyond the trees. Maybe a mile, maybe 2. "Guess we're walking," Atlas barked once. They moved into the forest. Snow crunched beneath Caleb's boots as they followed the coordinates deeper into the mountains. The trail was barely visible now, just a faint depression in the ground where vehicles might have passed decades earlier. The forest grew thicker, older. Some of the pine trees were massive, their trunks wide enough that 2 men could barely wrap their arms around them. Atlas suddenly stopped. His ears stood straight. "What is it?" The dog sniffed the air. Then he trotted ahead. Caleb followed. After another half-mile, the trees began to thin. The land opened into a narrow valley hidden between 2 rocky ridges. And there, sitting in the center of the clearing, was a house. Or what used to be one. The structure leaned slightly to one side, its wooden boards gray and weathered from years of mountain storms. Windows were broken, the porch had partially collapsed, and snow had gathered along the sagging roof. Beside the house stood a large barn. Its red paint had long since faded to brown. Atlas ran ahead. The dog circled the house once before stopping near the porch steps. Caleb approached slowly. "This place has been empty a long time," he murmured. He climbed the steps carefully. The wood creaked beneath his weight. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust and old wood. Furniture sat exactly where it had been left decades earlier. A rocking chair, a kitchen table, a stone fireplace blackened with soot. But something else caught Caleb's attention. On the far wall, hanging above the fireplace, a clock. A large wooden wall clock. Its glass face was cracked, and its hands had stopped moving. Caleb stepped closer. His stomach tightened. 3:47. The exact same time as the pocket watch. Atlas began pacing the room. The dog sniffed along the floorboards, the walls, the fireplace. Then Atlas stopped suddenly. He looked toward the back of the house. His tail stiffened. "What is it, boy?" Atlas barked. Once. Then he ran toward the barn outside. Caleb followed. The barn door hung half open. Inside, the air was colder. Dust drifted through the light that spilled through gaps in the wooden walls. Atlas moved deeper into the building. Then he stopped in the center of the floor. The dog sniffed once, twice. Then he began scratching at the ground. Hard. Wood splintered beneath his paws. Caleb rushed forward. "Hey, what did you find?" Atlas kept digging. The boards cracked. Finally, one of the planks broke loose. Caleb pulled the broken board aside. Underneath it was darkness. A square opening cut directly into the ground. Caleb knelt down. A wooden ladder disappeared into the shadows below. Atlas looked at Caleb, then back at the hole. Caleb exhaled slowly. "Well, Uncle Samuel," He grabbed his flashlight. "I think we just found your secret." Atlas wagged his tail once, and somewhere below them, the past waited. Caleb Brooks stood over the opening in the barn floor, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness below. Dust floated in the narrow shaft of light, drifting slowly like snow in still air. The wooden ladder disappeared into blackness. Atlas leaned forward, sniffing the edge of the opening. His ears were stiff and forward, every muscle in his body alert. Caleb studied the ladder carefully before stepping closer. The wood looked old, but not rotten. Whoever built this place had done it right. He clicked on the flashlight and aimed it downward again. The beam revealed packed dirt walls and a narrow shaft that dropped about 10 feet before opening into something wider. A tunnel. Caleb exhaled slowly. "Well," he muttered, "that explains the coordinates." Atlas gave a soft bark. "You want to go first?" Caleb asked. The dog wagged his tail once but didn't move. Smart dog. Caleb grabbed the ladder rails and tested them with his weight. Solid. He climbed down slowly, one step at a time. The wood creaked beneath his boots, but held steady. Halfway down, the temperature changed. The air became colder. Still. When Caleb reached the bottom, his boots touched packed dirt. Atlas followed immediately, descending the ladder with the practiced agility of a trained service dog. Within seconds, he was beside Caleb, already sniffing the ground and walls. The tunnel stretched forward beneath the barn. Concrete reinforced the ceiling and sides. Caleb raised the flashlight and scanned the walls. Someone had built this carefully. Not a makeshift hideout. A real structure. The beam caught something on the wall. Caleb stepped closer. Old metal brackets held several framed photographs. The glass was dusty, but the images were still visible. Men in military uniforms. Black and white photos. Helicopters. Transport trucks. Caleb wiped one of the frames with his sleeve. The picture showed a group of soldiers standing beside a cargo truck. One of them looked familiar. Caleb leaned closer. Uncle Samuel. The man in the photograph stood near the center of the group, younger but unmistakable. His uniform looked older than Caleb's army gear, probably from the early 70s. Atlas sniffed along the wall, moving deeper into the tunnel. "Wait up," Caleb called quietly. The tunnel continued for nearly 30 yards before widening into a small underground chamber. Caleb stepped inside and slowly turned the flashlight in a circle. Metal shelves lined the walls. Dust-covered boxes. Military crates. A long wooden workbench. And maps. Dozens of maps. They were pinned across one wall like a command center. Caleb approached slowly. Some maps showed sections of Wyoming. Others showed mountain ranges across the western United States. Several had markings, circles, lines, coordinates. Caleb leaned closer. Many of the markings were handwritten. Uncle Samuel's handwriting. Atlas moved toward the far side of the room and began sniffing around a stack of wooden crates. His nose pressed against the seams as if he could smell something buried inside. Caleb turned his attention back to the maps. A large topographic map of Wyoming hung in the center. A red circle marked the exact location of the farm above them. Another circle marked a second location deeper in the mountains. Between them ran a hand-drawn line. Supply route, or transport path. Caleb stepped back. "This wasn't just a cabin," he said quietly. "This was a base." Atlas barked once, Caleb looked over. The dog was now pawing lightly at the floor near the far wall. "What did you find?" Caleb walked over. Atlas stepped aside. The concrete floor showed faint scratches. Caleb crouched down and brushed the dust away with his hand. A square outline appeared in the floor. Another hidden panel. Caleb ran his fingers along the edges. Locked. He reached into his pocket. The brass key from the pocket watch. "Well, let's see if you fit." The key slid smoothly into the small metal lock embedded in the floor. He turned it. Click. The panel lifted slightly. Caleb gripped the edge and pulled. The heavy metal door opened with a low, grinding sound. Cold air rushed out from the darkness below. Atlas immediately stepped forward and sniffed the opening. His tail wagged slowly. Another ladder led downward, but this one was different. Steel. Industrial. Caleb shined the flashlight down. The ladder dropped deeper than the first. 20 feet, maybe more. The beam revealed a larger underground space beneath. Concrete walls, metal support beams. This wasn't a simple tunnel. It looked like an underground bunker. Caleb felt a strange chill crawl up his spine. "What were you hiding down here, Uncle?" Atlas gave a low growl. Not aggressive, uneasy. The dog's fur along his back stood slightly. Caleb rested a hand on the dog's shoulder. "Easy." Atlas relaxed but kept staring down the ladder. Caleb clipped a small lantern to his belt and tightened his gloves. "Guess we're going deeper." He placed one foot on the steel ladder. The metal rang softly in the quiet chamber. Step by step, Caleb descended into the lower bunker. Atlas followed close behind. The deeper they went, the colder the air became. When Caleb reached the bottom, the flashlight beam revealed a large underground room. Concrete walls, thick steel doors, storage racks, and something else. Military markings. Faded letters painted across one wall. U.S. Army Transport Storage. Caleb stared. "Army?" Atlas moved across the room, sniffing carefully. The dog paused beside a row of large metal containers stacked along the wall. Heavy crates, each one stamped with old military transport codes. Caleb brushed the dust off one crate. The markings were faded but readable. Wyoming. Transport Unit. Caleb's pulse quickened. "What the hell were you doing down here, Samuel?" Atlas sniffed one of the crates again. Then he moved toward the back wall. His nose traced along the concrete until he stopped suddenly. The dog barked sharply. Caleb turned the flashlight toward him. Atlas was pawing at the base of the wall, scratching hard. Concrete dust fell away with each swipe of his paws. "Hold on, boy." Caleb stepped closer and examined the spot. The concrete there looked slightly different, newer, like it had been patched. Caleb ran his hand along the wall. Hollow. His heart began to pound. "Atlas." The dog barked again, excited now. Caleb stepped back and studied the wall. If Atlas was right, something was hidden behind it. And whatever it was, Uncle Samuel had gone through a lot of trouble to hide it. Caleb looked around the bunker again. Maps, crates, military equipment, all pointing to something bigger than an old farm in the mountains. Atlas barked once more, then scratched harder at the wall. Concrete dust scattered across the floor. Caleb raised the flashlight. His breath slowed. "All right, boy." He grabbed a crowbar leaning against the wall. "Let's see what you found."
And behind that wall, the truth waited. Caleb Brooks tightened his grip on the crowbar. The metal tool felt heavy in his hands, its cold weight grounding him in the dim underground bunker. Atlas stood beside the concrete wall, claws scratching at the patched surface with growing urgency. Dust scattered across the floor. The German shepherd's breathing was quick now, his body tense with focus.
"Easy, Atlas," Caleb said quietly. But the dog couldn't help it. Something behind that wall had his full attention. Caleb stepped closer and pressed his ear against the concrete. Silence. Just the faint echo of wind moving somewhere above them through the mountains. Still, the patched concrete looked wrong. Too smooth compared to the rest of the bunker. Too deliberate. Caleb slid the crowbar into the seam Atlas had uncovered and pushed. The metal groaned against the concrete. Nothing moved. He repositioned the tool and pressed harder. Crack. A thin fracture spread across the surface. Atlas barked sharply. "All right," Caleb muttered. "Let's open it." He drove the crowbar deeper and leaned his weight into it. The concrete gave way with a loud snap. A chunk broke loose and dropped onto the floor. The echo rolled through the bunker. For a moment, everything went still. Then Caleb heard it. A faint shift of dirt somewhere above. The ground trembled slightly. Caleb froze. His chest tightened instantly. The sound was small, barely noticeable. But his mind reacted before logic could catch up. The bunker walls blurred. The cold air turned hot. And suddenly, Caleb Brooks wasn't standing in a Wyoming bunker anymore. He was back in Afghanistan. The memory struck like lightning. A narrow road, a convoy of armored trucks, dust rising under the tires. Then, a blast, the deafening roar of an explosion, the world flipping upside down. Caleb dropped the crowbar. His breath came fast and shallow. His hands trembled. "No." His voice was barely a whisper. Atlas noticed immediately. The German shepherd turned and rushed toward him, pressing his body firmly against Caleb's legs. Caleb's vision tunneled. The bunker walls seemed to close in. In his ears, he heard the sound again. The blast. The screaming. The radio chatter. "Brooks, move! Move!" Atlas barked sharply. Once. Twice. The dog jumped up, placing his front paws on Caleb's chest. Caleb staggered backward against the wall. Atlas pushed his muzzle under Caleb's chin and forced him to look down. The dog's eyes were steady, focused, present. Not the desert, not the war. Here. Now. Caleb inhaled slowly. Then again. Atlas stayed pressed against him until the shaking stopped. Minutes passed before Caleb finally spoke. "I'm all right." Atlas didn't move. Caleb placed a hand on the dog's neck. "Good boy." The bunker felt quiet again. The flashback faded. The mountains returned. Caleb bent down and picked up the crowbar. "Guess the past isn't done with me yet." Atlas wagged his tail gently. Caleb turned back toward the wall. The crack he'd created had widened. Another section of concrete looked ready to break loose. He wedged the crowbar in again and pushed. This time the wall gave way faster. Chunks of concrete crumbled away, revealing a narrow opening. Cold air rushed through. Caleb raised the flashlight. The beam cut through the gap. Behind the wall was another chamber. smaller, but carefully sealed. Atlas pushed past Caleb before he could stop him. The dog slipped through the opening and disappeared inside. "Atlas!" Caleb squeezed through after him. The room beyond was different from the bunker. Cleaner, more organized. A long metal desk sat against one wall. Shelves held stacks of documents protected in plastic sleeves. Maps, photographs, military reports. Atlas sniffed along the floor before stopping near the desk. His tail wagged slowly now. Curiosity, not alarm. Caleb approached the desk. On its surface lay a leather-bound notebook. The cover was cracked with age. Samuel Brooks. The name was stamped faintly across the front. Caleb opened it carefully. Inside were handwritten pages. Dates, locations, supply routes. He flipped through several entries. Then one paragraph stopped him cold. Transport convoy diverted. Command compromised. Gold shipment redirected to secure storage location until further orders. Caleb read the sentence again. Gold shipment. He turned the page. More entries, detailed records, descriptions of trucks, cargo weights, escort teams. Atlas suddenly barked. Caleb looked up. The dog had moved to the far corner of the room and was scratching at the floor again. Harder this time, more urgently. Caleb grabbed the flashlight and walked over. Another secret? Atlas kept digging. The concrete here was thinner, cracked. Caleb knelt and brushed away the dust. Metal. A large steel plate sat embedded in the floor, bolted down. Caleb ran his hand across it. Cold, heavy, industrial. His pulse quickened again. He looked back at the notebook. Gold shipment. Atlas barked again. Caleb stood slowly. "All right," he whispered. "If Uncle Samuel hid something." Atlas pawed at the plate again. The metal rang hollow. Caleb studied the bolts. Old, rusty, but removable. He grabbed the wrench from his pack. One by one, he loosened the bolts. The metal shrieked softly with each turn. Finally, the last bolt came free. Caleb braced himself and pulled. The plate lifted just enough for him to slide it aside. Beneath it was darkness, but not empty darkness. The flashlight beam revealed something massive beneath the floor. Rows of metal containers stacked tightly together. Military transport crates. Dozens of them. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. Atlas barked excitedly now. His tail wagged fast. Caleb slowly climbed down into the storage chamber. The crates were enormous. Each one stamped with faded military markings. Transport codes, unit numbers, dates. He brushed dust off the nearest crate. The stenciled letters became clearer. U.S. Army Reserve Storage. Caleb stared. His hands trembled again. Not from fear this time, from realization. If this is what I think it is. Atlas barked again. The dog placed a paw on one crate and looked at Caleb. Caleb reached for the metal latch. He hesitated, then slowly pulled it open. The lid creaked upward. Inside, something gleamed, even under decades of dust. A dull yellow shine. Caleb's heart pounded, but he didn't speak, not yet, because the truth was only beginning to surface. And whatever Samuel Brooks had hidden beneath this farm was far bigger than Caleb had ever imagined. Atlas stared into the crate, waiting. The beam of Caleb's flashlight trembled slightly as it touched the inside of the metal container. For a long moment he didn't breathe. The object inside looked simple, a rectangular bar, heavy, dull yellow beneath a thin coat of dust. Caleb reached down slowly, almost afraid the moment would vanish if he moved too fast. His fingers closed around the object and lifted it out of the crate. The weight nearly surprised him. Solid, cold. He brushed his thumb across the surface, dust smeared away. Underneath it, a clear stamp appeared in the metal. U.S. Gold Reserve. Caleb froze. His heart began pounding so loudly he could hear it in his ears. "No way," he whispered. Atlas gave a soft bark. Caleb stared at the bar in his hands. It was real. A gold bar. He set it carefully on the floor and lifted the flashlight toward the open crate. Inside were more bars, dozens of them, stacked neatly in rows like bricks. Every single one stamped with the same seal. Caleb sat back on his heels. "Samuel, what did you do?" Atlas sniffed the edge of the crate and then turned, trotting across the chamber toward another container. His claws tapped against the concrete as he moved. He barked again. Caleb followed slowly, still trying to process what he had just seen. The second crate looked identical to the first, same military markings, same transport codes, same year. Caleb opened the latch. The lid creaked upward. More gold. Row after row of heavy bars filled the crate from corner to corner. Caleb's breath left his lungs in a slow exhale. He stood there in silence, flashlight moving from one crate to the next. Atlas walked across the storage room, sniffing each container carefully, tail wagging slowly as if he knew they had discovered something important. But Caleb's mind was already racing. How much gold was here? 10 crates? 20? He walked across the chamber, counting. 30. 32 containers stacked tightly across the underground room. His stomach tightened. Each crate could hold hundreds of bars. He remembered something from a documentary he had watched years ago. A single gold bar weighed about 27 pounds, and each one was worth tens of thousands of dollars. Caleb rubbed his face slowly. This can't be real. Atlas returned and sat beside him, watching quietly. Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out Samuel's notebook. He flipped through the pages quickly. Then he found it. A list. Handwritten numbers, cargo weights, transport totals. Shipment, 4,800 bars. Caleb stared at the number. His voice came out barely above a whisper. 4,800? Atlas tilted his head. Caleb tried to do the math in his head. One bar could be worth around $40,000, maybe more with modern gold prices. He swallowed. That's nearly $200 million. The number felt unreal. Atlas nudged his arm gently with his nose. Caleb looked down at him. "Well, boy," he said quietly, "you just found the most expensive dog toy in American history." Atlas wagged his tail. But Caleb's smile faded quickly, because another thought had just entered his mind. Gold like this didn't simply disappear. This shipment had belonged to the United States government, and if it had gone missing, someone must have been looking for it. For decades. Caleb turned back to Samuel's notebook. He flipped through the last few pages. The handwriting became more rushed near the end. One entry stood out. Convoy compromised, orders intercepted, cannot trust command. Gold secured in Wyoming location, hidden until truth comes out. Caleb leaned back against the concrete wall. Samuel hadn't stolen the gold. He had hidden it, protected it. But from what? Atlas suddenly growled, a low sound deep in his throat. Caleb sat up. What is it? The German shepherd's ears shot forward, his eyes locked toward the tunnel leading back to the ladder. Caleb held his breath. At first, he heard nothing. Then, a faint noise, far above them. Footsteps. Caleb's pulse spiked. Someone was inside the barn. Atlas moved toward the tunnel entrance, body tense. Another sound echoed faintly through the shaft. A voice, muffled. You sure this is the place? Caleb's stomach dropped. He switched off the flashlight instantly. The bunker fell into darkness. Only the faint lantern glow on his belt remained. Atlas stood beside him, silent now, listening. The footsteps above them moved slowly across the barn floor. Wood creaked. Another voice answered. Coordinates match the rumor. Rumor. Caleb felt a chill spread through his chest. Someone else knew about this place. Keep looking, the first voice said. We didn't drive 6 hours for nothing. Atlas's growl deepened. Caleb crouched low and placed a hand on the dog's neck. Quiet, he whispered. Above them, the footsteps stopped. For a long moment, the barn fell silent again. Then, a loud thud, the sound of something heavy being moved. The trap door. Caleb felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Atlas's ears twitched. Another creak echoed down the ladder shaft, metal scraping. Someone had found the entrance. Caleb looked at the stacks of gold around him, then at the narrow ladder leading up. His voice came out in a quiet breath. Well, Atlas? The dog looked up at him. I think we're not the only ones hunting treasure tonight. Atlas's tail stopped wagging, and above them, the ladder began to move. The faint metallic creak echoed down the shaft like a warning carried through stone. Caleb Brooks didn't move. His hand remained steady on Atlas's neck, fingers buried in the thick black and tan fur while both of them listened. Another sound followed. Boots. Someone was stepping carefully onto the steel ladder. A single rung vibrated, then another. Atlas's ears pressed forward, every muscle in his body tight. Caleb slowly reached down and dimmed the small lantern clipped to his belt until only the faintest glow remained. The underground chamber fell into deep shadows. He whispered, barely audible, "Stay." Atlas lowered his body to the ground instantly, silent and alert. The ladder creaked again. Whoever was coming down was moving cautiously. Caleb stepped behind a stack of crates and crouched low. His mind worked quickly. 2 voices earlier. Maybe more. Treasure hunters. Or worse. Another rung groaned. Halfway down now. The light from above shifted as someone blocked the barn's doorway. A beam of white light pierced the darkness. Flashlight. Caleb held his breath. The beam slid down the ladder slowly, illuminating the shaft. Then a man's boots appeared. Dusty hiking boots. Heavy. The man descended carefully until he reached the bunker floor. He stepped off the ladder and swung the flashlight around the room. Caleb watched through the narrow gap between 2 crates. The man looked to be in his late 40s. Bearded. Weathered face. A hunting jacket zipped halfway up. Another set of boots appeared on the ladder. The second man climbed down behind him. This one was younger, maybe mid-30s. He carried a small rifle slung across his chest. Atlas's low growl vibrated quietly beside Caleb. Caleb gently pressed his hand against the dog's shoulder. "Quiet," he whispered. The two men began walking slowly across the bunker floor. The younger one spoke first. "You think the story's real?" The older man shrugged. "Old war rumors usually start somewhere." He scanned the walls with his flashlight. Hidden bunker, Army transport site, missing shipment. The beam of light drifted across the concrete ceiling. "If there's anything down here, we'll find it." Caleb's jaw tightened. The men moved closer to the center of the room, closer to the crates. Atlas's body tensed. Caleb felt it immediately. The dog knew. They were seconds away from discovering everything. The younger man stopped suddenly. "Hold up!" His flashlight beam landed on the open steel plate in the floor. The storage chamber. The older man walked over and looked down into the opening. "Well, look at that." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Guess the rumor wasn't just a rumor." He swung his flashlight deeper into the chamber. The beam brushed across the crates. Gold bars glinted faintly in the light. Both men froze. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then the younger man laughed quietly. "Holy hell." The older man climbed down the ladder into the storage chamber. Caleb watched as the flashlight beam moved across the gold stacks. The man knelt beside the open crate Caleb had discovered earlier. He picked up one of the bars, turned it over in his hand. Then he let out a slow whistle. Jackpot. The younger man climbed down behind him. "Is it real?" The older man held the bar toward the flashlight. "Real enough to buy a city." The younger man's eyes widened. "How much do you think is here?" The older man looked around the chamber. "Couple $100 million, easy." Caleb felt Atlas shift beside him. The dog's muscles were coiled now, ready. The younger man spoke again. "What about the owner?" The older man shrugged. "Farm's been abandoned for decades." Then he paused. His eyes moved slowly toward the ladder, toward the bunker above. "Still, we should make sure." He started climbing back up. Caleb's pulse spiked. Atlas's growl deepened. The man stepped onto the bunker floor again. His flashlight beam swept across the room, slowly, methodically. It moved across the shelves, the desk, Samuel's notebook, then toward the stacks of crates where Caleb and Atlas were hiding. Caleb felt his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The beam of light came closer, closer. Atlas's breathing slowed. His body lowered even more. Then, the dog's paw shifted slightly on the dusty floor. A faint scrape echoed in the quiet bunker. The flashlight stopped instantly. The man's voice cut through the darkness. "You hear that?" Below, the younger man called up. "What?" The older man stepped forward slowly. His light aimed directly at the crates now. "Someone's down here." Atlas's ears flattened. Caleb exhaled slowly. Then he whispered into the darkness. "Easy, boy." But the moment had already arrived. The flashlight beam suddenly swung around the corner of the crate, and the man saw them. A veteran and a German shepherd, standing beside a mountain of gold. The man's eyes widened. "Well now," his voice carried a quiet edge. "Looks like the farm isn't abandoned after all." Atlas stood up slowly, the fur along his back rising. and the bunker filled with a silence so thick it felt like the air itself had stopped moving. Atlas stood between Caleb and the two strangers, his body low and tense, shoulders forward, teeth barely visible behind curled lips. A deep growl rolled quietly through his chest. The sound echoed softly through the bunker. The older man raised his hand slightly, palm out. "Easy there," he said calmly. "We're not here to fight." His flashlight beam rested on Caleb's face now. Up close, the man's eyes narrowed slightly. "You military?" Caleb didn't answer immediately. He studied the two men carefully. The younger one still stood in the lower chamber beside the open crate, his rifle hanging loosely across his chest. His eyes flicked between Caleb, the dog, and the gold. "Depends who's asking," Caleb said quietly. The older man let out a slow breath. "Name's Rick Turner. That's my brother, Danny." Danny nodded from below. Rick gestured around the bunker with the flashlight. "Looks like we all found the same secret." Atlas's growl deepened. Rick noticed and took a small step back. All right, he muttered. "Good dog." Caleb stepped forward slightly and rested his hand on Atlas's neck. "Stand down," he whispered. Atlas didn't relax completely, but the growl faded. Rick looked relieved. "Appreciate that." Danny climbed back up from the storage chamber, wiping dust off his jacket. "You seeing this, Rick?" he said. "There's enough gold down there to fill a bank vault." Rick nodded slowly. "Yeah, I noticed." His eyes shifted back to Caleb. "So, I'm guessing you found it first?" Caleb didn't deny it. Rick studied him for a moment. Then he sighed. "Well, that saves us some digging." Danny looked confused. "What do you mean?" Rick turned to him. "I mean, someone already opened the chamber for us." Danny grinned. "Even better." Caleb's voice came out calm but firm. "This property belongs to me." Rick shrugged. "Maybe." Danny laughed. "Maybe?" Rick continued speaking, ignoring his brother. "But if that gold is what I think it is, it doesn't belong to any of us." Caleb narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" Rick stepped closer to the desk and picked up Samuel's notebook. He flipped through the pages quickly. Then he nodded. "Just like the story." Caleb felt a chill crawl through him. "You knew about this place." Rick looked up. "Not exactly." He tapped the notebook. "But we knew about the shipment." Danny leaned against one of the crates. "Back in '73, the Army lost a convoy carrying reserve gold." Rick continued. "Officially, it vanished during transport. Unofficially," he said, glancing around the bunker. "A lot of people believed it was hidden." Caleb folded his arms. "So you've been hunting it?" Rick nodded. "Off and on for 20 years. Danny chuckled. "Turns out we were about 30 minutes too late." Atlas watched both men carefully, his eyes never leaving them. Rick closed the notebook and placed it back on the desk. Then he looked at Caleb again. "You the nephew?" Caleb said nothing. Rick smiled slightly. "Samuel Brooks." He tapped the notebook again. "Man had a reputation." Caleb's jaw tightened. "What kind of reputation?" Rick shrugged. "The kind that gets you in trouble with powerful people." Danny spoke up. "Samuel intercepted the shipment." Rick corrected him. "No. He protected it." Danny rolled his eyes. "Same difference." Rick shook his head. "Not quite."
He walked over to the maps on the wall. Your uncle believed someone high up in the command chain planned to steal the gold. Caleb's chest tightened. Rick pointed to one of the maps. Convoy was diverted here. Hidden. Danny crossed his arms. And now we found it. Rick looked at Caleb again. So the real question is, what happens next? Caleb didn't answer, because deep down, he already knew the truth. Gold worth nearly $200 million didn't stay secret for long. Atlas suddenly barked, a sharp, warning sound. Everyone froze. Rick frowned. What now? Atlas ran toward the ladder shaft. His ears were forward again, listening. Caleb moved beside him. He heard it too. Engines. Faint at first, then louder. Vehicles climbing the narrow mountain road outside the farm. More than one. Headlights flashed briefly through the cracks in the barn floor above. Danny cursed under his breath. That's not good. Rick's face turned serious. How many people did you tell about this place? Danny raised his hands.
None. Rick looked back at Caleb. You call anyone? Caleb shook his head. No. The sound of engines grew louder. Doors slammed above. Multiple voices echoed faintly through the barn. Atlas growled again. Rick exhaled slowly. Well, he muttered, looks like the secret just got crowded. Footsteps thundered across the barn floor. Heavy. Boots. More than 4 people. Then, the trapdoor above the ladder burst open. Bright flashlight beams flooded the shaft, and a voice shouted down into the bunker. Federal agents! Everyone stay exactly where you are. Caleb looked at the stacks of gold, then at the ladder, then at Atlas. Because suddenly, finding the treasure had become the easy part. Now they had to survive what came next. The bright white beams of several flashlights poured down the ladder shaft, turning the bunker into a maze of long shadows. Atlas stepped forward, body tense again, placing himself between Caleb and the ladder. His growl vibrated low and steady. Easy, Caleb whispered, resting a hand on the dog's back. Boots clanged against the steel rungs. 1, 2, 3 men descended quickly into the bunker. All of them wore dark jackets with bold yellow letters across the chest. Federal Investigation Unit. The first man reached the floor and immediately swept his flashlight across the room. His eyes landed on the crates, then the open chamber, then the gold. His expression hardened. Well, he muttered quietly, so the rumor was true. 2 more agents stepped down behind him. Within seconds, the bunker was filled with sharp white light and the sound of radios crackling. Area secure, one of the agents said into his shoulder mic. The first man walked slowly toward Caleb. He looked to be in his early 50s. Calm, measured. The kind of man who had seen a lot of complicated situations. His eyes flicked briefly toward Atlas. Friendly dog? Caleb nodded once. He protects what's his. The agent gave a faint smile. Can't blame him. Then the man's gaze moved to the open crate. His expression changed. Even though he had probably expected it, the sight of the gold still carried weight. He turned back to Caleb. Name? Caleb Brooks. The agent raised his eyebrows slightly. Brooks. He glanced at Samuel's notebook on the desk. Any relation to Samuel Brooks? My uncle. The agent exhaled slowly. That explains a lot. Danny shifted nervously nearby. Rick stood quietly beside him, arms crossed. The agent noticed them next. And you two? Rick answered calmly. Rick and Danny Turner. The agent nodded once. All right. He turned back toward the crates. Gentlemen, you've all just walked into one of the strangest missing person cases in U.S. military history. Caleb frowned. Missing person? The agent gestured toward the gold. This shipment vanished in 1973. He pointed toward the bunker walls. Convoy escort team disappeared the same night. Caleb's stomach tightened. Disappeared? The agent nodded. 6 soldiers. His voice lowered slightly. They were transporting Federal Reserve gold to a military storage facility in Colorado. He looked directly at Caleb. The official report said the convoy was ambushed, but the investigation never found the gold. Atlas's ears twitched as the man spoke. The dog looked from one face to another, as if sensing the tension in the room. Rick stepped forward slightly. So Samuel Brooks hid it. The agent studied him. That appears to be the case. Rick nodded slowly. I always thought that's what happened. Danny looked confused. Wait, if he hid it, why didn't he ever tell anyone? The agent picked up Samuel's notebook. He flipped through the pages carefully. Then he stopped on the final entry. His eyes narrowed slightly. Well, he said quietly, according to this, he tried. Caleb stepped closer. What do you mean? The agent turned the notebook toward him. The last entry had been written in hurried handwriting. Command compromised. Someone inside operation planning theft. Cannot trust chain of command. Caleb read the line twice. Rick leaned over his shoulder. Your uncle thought someone high up planned to steal the gold. The agent nodded. Which means hiding it may have saved it. Danny rubbed the back of his neck. So, what happens now? The agent closed the notebook. What happens now, he said carefully, is the federal government takes custody of this gold. Danny groaned. Figures. Rick gave him a quiet look that said, be quiet. The agent continued. But the man who discovered it, he looked directly at Caleb, may be entitled to something. Caleb frowned. I didn't do anything. The agent nodded toward Atlas. You might want to thank your dog. Several of the agents smiled slightly. Atlas wagged his tail once, but Caleb's attention had moved elsewhere. Those soldiers, he said quietly. The ones who disappeared. The agent's expression changed again, more serious now. That part of the story is still a mystery. He gestured toward the bunker. We've been searching for answers for 50 years. Rick spoke quietly. And now? The agent glanced around the room. Now we might finally know what happened. He turned to one of the other agents. Call in the recovery team. The man nodded and spoke into his radio. Within minutes, the barn above filled with activity. More vehicles arrived, equipment, lights. The quiet, abandoned farm transformed into a full federal investigation site. Hours passed. Caleb sat on an old crate while agents carefully photographed and documented everything. Atlas rested beside him, head on his paws. Rick and Danny sat nearby under watch, but not restrained. Finally, the lead agent returned. He sat down across from Caleb. My name's Agent Mark Delgado, he said. Caleb nodded. Delgado glanced at Atlas. Your dog's going to be famous. Caleb gave a faint smile. He deserves it. Delgado leaned back slightly. You realize the value of what was found here tonight? Caleb nodded slowly. About 200 million. Closer to 198, Delgado corrected. Caleb exhaled. Still a lot. Delgado studied him carefully. You don't seem excited. Caleb looked across the bunker, at the crates, at Samuel's maps, at the notebook. My uncle didn't hide this for money. Delgado waited. Caleb continued quietly. He hid it because something was wrong. Delgado nodded slowly. That's what we're starting to believe too. Atlas suddenly lifted his head. His ears twitched again. Caleb noticed. What is it, boy? Atlas stood up. He walked slowly toward the far wall of the bunker, the place where the patched concrete had once hidden Samuel's second chamber. The dog sniffed along the floor. Then he stopped. His nose pressed against another section of the wall. Atlas pawed at the concrete once, then again. Delgado frowned. What's he doing? Caleb stepped closer. Atlas barked once, sharp, focused. Caleb knelt beside him. The concrete there sounded different when he tapped it. Hollow. Caleb looked up at Delgado. Agent. Delgado's eyes narrowed. Don't tell me. Atlas scratched harder. Concrete dust fell away. Caleb stood slowly. Looks like my dog isn't finished yet. The entire bunker fell silent again, because somewhere behind that wall, another secret waited. Atlas scratched harder at the concrete. Each strike of his paw sent small flakes of dust sliding down the wall and onto the bunker floor. The sound echoed softly through the underground chamber. Agent Delgado stepped closer, his flashlight beam following the dog's movements. You're telling me, he said slowly, that dog found another compartment? Caleb crouched beside Atlas. I've learned not to doubt him. Atlas barked once and stepped back. Caleb knocked gently against the wall with his knuckles. The hollow sound came back immediately. Delgado exchanged a look with one of the other agents. Well, he said, let's see what your partner uncovered. Within minutes, 2 agents returned with tools from above. A hammer, a pry bar, a portable drill. Atlas watched every movement, his tail moving slowly back and forth as if he knew they were getting close. Caleb stood nearby, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the patch of concrete. The drill whined as it bit into the wall. Dust filled the air. Small cracks began spreading across the surface. Then, a loud snap. A section of the concrete broke loose and dropped to the floor. Behind it was darkness. Delgado lifted his flashlight. The beam revealed a narrow opening leading into another chamber. Smaller, lower, almost hidden. One of the agents leaned closer. There's something inside. Caleb stepped forward. Atlas slipped through the opening before anyone could stop him. Atlas! But the dog was already inside. His nails clicked against the concrete floor. He sniffed the room quickly, then barked once. Clear, confident. Caleb crawled through the opening after him. The chamber was barely large enough to stand in. A small metal cabinet sat against the far wall. Next to it stood a single wooden crate. Unlike the others, this one looked older, more personal. Delgado and the other agents squeezed into the space behind Caleb. The air smelled faintly of old paper. Caleb opened the cabinet first. Inside were file folders sealed in plastic. Photographs, military reports, letters. Delgado carefully lifted one of the folders. His eyes widened as he read. Oh my. He turned to Caleb. These are official reports from the convoy mission.
Caleb leaned closer. What do they say? Delgado flipped through several pages. His expression darkened.
This confirms your uncle's suspicions. He pointed to one of the documents. Several officers involved in the convoy were later investigated for corruption. Rick leaned through the doorway behind them. I knew it, Danny whispered. So Samuel was protecting the gold. Delgado nodded slowly. And protecting evidence. He set the folder aside and opened the wooden crate. Inside were several sealed envelopes and a small metal box. Caleb lifted the box carefully. It was surprisingly light. He opened the lid. Inside sat a single object. A military dog tag. Delgado frowned. That's strange. Caleb picked up the tag. The metal was worn with age. The name stamped into it was barely visible beneath scratches. But Caleb read it clearly. Sergeant David Brooks. Caleb's breath caught. My father. The room fell silent. Caleb stared at the tag in disbelief. My dad served during that time, he whispered. Delgado leaned closer. This may explain why Samuel trusted you with the watch. Caleb looked up slowly. What do you mean? Delgado flipped through the documents again. There's a report here about the convoy escort team. He read the names quietly. Then he stopped. His eyes moved back to the dog tag. Sergeant David Brooks. Caleb's chest tightened. That was my father's name. Delgado nodded. He was part of the escort team transporting the gold. Caleb felt the ground shift beneath him. But my dad died when I was a kid. Delgado read another page. This report says the escort team disappeared during the convoy incident. Caleb shook his head slowly. That's not what my family was told. Rick spoke softly from the doorway. Families were given different stories sometimes. Caleb stared at the tag in his hand. The metal felt heavier now. Atlas stepped closer and pressed his head gently against Caleb's leg. The familiar weight of the dog's presence steadied him. Delgado closed the folder carefully. Your uncle kept these records hidden for decades. He looked at Caleb. Maybe he was waiting for the right person to find them. Caleb's voice was quiet. Family. Delgado nodded. Exactly. The agent stood and looked around the chamber. This changes the entire investigation. He turned toward the doorway. We didn't just find the missing gold tonight. He looked back at Caleb. We found the truth about what happened to those soldiers. Caleb looked down at the dog tag again. For 50 years, the story had been buried beneath a forgotten farm, hidden beneath concrete, protected by a man who refused to let corruption win, and discovered by a veteran and the dog who never stopped searching. Atlas wagged his tail gently. Delgado spoke again. There's one more thing you should know. Caleb looked up. The government may reclaim the gold, Delgado said carefully. But the man who discovered it, he gestured toward the bunker, will receive a recovery reward. Danny leaned forward. How much? Delgado gave a faint smile. 5%. Rick did the math immediately. Danny's eyes widened. 5% of 198 million? Delgado nodded. Caleb exhaled slowly. Nearly $10 million. The room fell quiet again. But Caleb wasn't thinking about money. He looked at Atlas, then at the dog tag in his hand. For the first time since the war, something inside him felt lighter.
The past hadn't just been uncovered tonight. It had been understood. And somewhere in that moment, a wounded soldier began to feel something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. For a long time, Caleb Brooks stood quietly inside the hidden chamber, the cold metal dog tag resting in the center of his palm. Atlas leaned against his leg, warm and steady. Around them, the bunker buzzed with quiet activity. Federal agents moved carefully through the rooms, photographing documents, cataloging gold bars, and sealing crates for transport.
The place that had once been a secret was now a full investigation site. But inside Caleb's mind, everything felt strangely calm. Agent Delgado stepped beside him again. "You all right?" he asked. Caleb nodded slowly. "I think so." He turned the dog tag over once more before slipping it carefully into his pocket. "My father was part of this convoy," Caleb said quietly. Delgado nodded. "That's what the records show." Caleb stared toward the open chamber where the gold had been discovered. "My family was told he died in a training accident." Delgado's voice softened. "That was the cover story used when the investigation stalled." Caleb let out a long breath. "So my uncle knew the truth." "Looks that way." Caleb nodded. "And he waited." "For someone he trusted," Delgado said. Atlas wagged his tail slightly as Caleb scratched behind his ears. The dog looked up at him with the same calm loyalty he had shown in combat years earlier. Caleb smiled faintly. "You always did have good instincts, boy." Outside the bunker, the first light of dawn began creeping across the Wyoming mountains. The long night was finally ending. Hours later, Caleb sat on the back step of the old farmhouse, watching the sunrise spread across the valley. The mountains glowed orange beneath the morning sky. Atlas lay beside him, head resting on his boots. Below the hill, several government trucks waited while teams carefully loaded the sealed crates of gold. Rick and Danny Turner stood nearby under supervision, but no longer looked tense. Danny whistled softly. "I still can't believe there was $200 million under that barn." Rick chuckled quietly. "Not 200. 198, Danny corrected. Rick looked over toward Caleb. "You know what 5% of that is?" Caleb shrugged. "More than I ever expected to see." Danny grinned. "That's nearly $10 million. Rick nudged him. "Give the man some space." Danny nodded and wandered off toward the trucks. Rick stayed where he was. After a moment, he spoke quietly. "You're not acting like someone who just became a millionaire." Caleb looked out across the valley. "I spent years thinking about what I lost." Rick waited. "Friends," Caleb continued. "Sleep. Peace of mind." He scratched Atlas behind the ears again. "This dog helped me find some of that back." Rick nodded slowly. "And the gold?" Caleb smiled faintly. "That's not really the point." Rick studied him for a moment. "Your uncle would probably be proud." Caleb looked toward the barn. "I hope so." Later that morning, Agent Delgado joined Caleb near the farmhouse. He handed him a folder. "These are the official recovery documents," he said. Caleb opened the folder. Inside were legal forms and statements confirming the discovery. At the bottom was the number. Recovery compensation, 5% of recovered assets. Caleb closed the folder slowly. Delgado leaned against the porch railing. "Most people would start planning a new house," he said. "A boat. A vacation." Caleb watched the valley below. A group of agents carefully carried the final crate out of the bunker. "Agent Delgado," Caleb said. "Yes?" "There's a lot of veterans around here." Delgado nodded. "Wyoming has one of the highest veteran populations in the country." Caleb continued. "Some of them struggle." Delgado looked at him thoughtfully. "PTSD." Caleb nodded. "I know what that feels like." Atlas lifted his head and looked at Caleb. "You've got nearly $10 million coming," Delgado said. "That kind of money could change a lot of lives." Caleb looked back at the farmhouse, the land, the barn, the quiet valley. "I've been thinking about that." Delgado waited. Caleb finally spoke. "My uncle protected that gold because he believed people mattered more than money." Delgado smiled faintly. "That sounds like a soldier." Caleb nodded. "I want to turn this farm into something better." Delgado raised an eyebrow. "What did you have in mind?" Caleb scratched Atlas's neck. "A place for veterans. Somewhere they can heal. Train service dogs. Reconnect with life." Atlas wagged his tail as if he understood every word. Delgado looked across the farm slowly. Then he nodded. "That might be the best use of a hidden treasure I've ever heard." Caleb smiled. "I think my uncle would approve." Above them, the Wyoming sky stretched wide and clear, and for the first time in years, the future looked brighter than the past. Autumn came quietly to the Wyoming Valley. The same mountains that had once hidden secrets beneath frozen soil now stood peaceful beneath a pale blue sky. The wind moved gently through the tall grass around the old farmhouse, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow. The place looked different now. The broken barn had been repaired. The rusted gates had been replaced with sturdy wooden fencing. A new sign stood near the dirt road that led into the valley. Brooks Veterans Ranch, Service Dog Training and Recovery Center. Caleb Brooks stood near the fence, watching the morning sun rise over the mountains. Atlas sat beside him, older now, but still strong, his thick coat shining under the golden light. Across the open field, several men and women walked slowly along a gravel path. Some of them carried quiet burdens visible only in their posture. Others walked beside young German shepherds learning the first steps of training. The ranch had become exactly what Caleb had imagined that morning months ago. A place where soldiers could breathe again. A place where dogs and humans healed together. Caleb leaned against the fence rail. Agent Delgado's voice came from behind him. "Looks like the place is doing well." Caleb turned and smiled. Delgado walked across the grass, hands in his jacket pockets as he looked around the ranch. "You've built something special here," he said. Caleb shrugged modestly. "I had help." Atlas wagged his tail when Delgado approached. The agent bent down and scratched the dog behind the ears. "You're still the hero of this story, you know." Atlas responded by licking Delgado's hand. Delgado laughed. "I'll take that as a thank you." They stood together quietly for a moment. In the distance, a young veteran knelt beside a nervous dog, patiently encouraging it to follow simple commands. Another man sat on a wooden bench, speaking with a counselor under the shade of an old cottonwood tree. Life had returned to the farm, but the old barn remained exactly as it had been left the night everything changed. Caleb had kept one thing untouched. Delgado nodded toward the building. "You ever go back down there?" Caleb followed his gaze. "Once." Delgado raised an eyebrow. "Only once?" Caleb nodded. "Didn't feel like I needed to after that." Delgado understood. Some places carried memories too powerful to visit often. Caleb reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. He unfolded the fabric slowly. Inside lay the old pocket watch, the same one that had started everything. The cracked glass had been cleaned, the brass case polished slightly. But Caleb had never repaired it. The hands of the watch still pointed to the same time they had when he first opened it. 3:47. Delgado looked at the watch carefully. "You ever think about fixing it?" Caleb shook his head. "No." "Why not?" Caleb turned the watch gently between his fingers. "Because it reminds me of something important." Delgado waited. Caleb looked across the field where Atlas now walked beside a young veteran learning how to train a service dog. "For years, I thought that moment meant loss. The moment everything broke." He closed the watch slowly. "But it wasn't." Delgado studied him. "What was it?" Caleb smiled faintly. "The moment everything changed." Atlas finished his walk across the field and trotted back toward Caleb. He stopped beside him and sat, looking up with the same loyal eyes he had carried through war, through fear, and through the long night beneath the barn. Caleb knelt and placed a hand gently on the dog's head. "You found it, boy." Atlas wagged his tail. Caleb looked once more at the watch in his hand. Then he walked toward the barn. Inside, the wooden beams creaked softly as they had for decades. Dust floated through thin shafts of sunlight. At the center of the barn wall, Caleb had mounted a simple wooden frame. Inside the frame hung the old pocket watch, the hands still frozen at 3:47. Below it was a small plaque. It read, "Sometimes the moment that breaks your life is the same moment that rebuilds it." Caleb stepped back. Atlas sat beside him. Outside, the sounds of laughter and conversation drifted through the open barn door. Veterans. Dogs. Life returning. Caleb looked down at Atlas. "You ready for another walk?" Atlas stood immediately, tail wagging. Together they stepped out into the Wyoming sunlight. And somewhere behind them, the old clock remained still. But the lives it had changed were finally moving forward. If this story touched your heart, I want to ask you something simple. Right now, just type the number 1 in the comments. That little 1 means you believe loyalty still exists in this world, just like Atlas showed Caleb. And if you've ever had a dog who stood by you during a hard time, type 0 in the comments for them. I read the comments every day, and I truly love seeing where you're watching from. So after you type your 1 or 0, tell me your city or country too. And if stories like this mean something to you, stories about courage, loyalty, and second chances, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Because the next story might be even more powerful. Another veteran, another loyal dog, and another secret waiting to be discovered. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next story.